Hello, my name is Eugene,
My name is Chris.
and we are the co founders of a project called The Courage to Look. And this is our podcast series entitled Deepening the Conversation.
Yes, today we're with Naomi. Naomi, would you like to introduce yourself?
It's actually Naomi, and that is my middle name. It's a Japanese name, and I think in some ways it's indicative of this whole situation. I was born after the war, and my parents, who are Japanese Americans, really wanted us to be American. So they gave me a name that was Japanese, but it could also be seen as uh, a white name.
Hmm.
Uh, I know Eugene because we have been doing Dharma practice together, and I am 75, and I've lived through a whole bunch of history, and that's why I think he thought I could contribute to giving somewhat of an arc of what's happened during my lifetime.
So, you were born in Hawaii and also have had a very successful career life in the mainland. Tell us about your family history and your experience of coming to the mainland.
Well, my family history is that I don't know if you know about the way the generations are counted, but my parents are Nisei. My grandparents immigrated from Japan um, to work on the plantations. And then, you know, I think there was a very huge emphasis in education. And so both of my parents became, managed to become educated. My mother was one of the few people who had gone to college and became a librarian, and my father um, went to law school. And so he was one of the first, I think, Japanese Americans to leave the islands and go to law school and come back.
And your choice to or decision to leave the experience of the Hawaiian Islands first before to come to the mainland. Um, what was it like living as a youth in Hawaii and hearing some of the stories of your grandparents?
Well, I think I was not that self reflective and I just took things for granted. And, we were told that Hawaii was a paradise of the Pacific and the great melting pot. But, looking back on it, it was highly divided by different ethnic groups. There was some mixing. I think it's different now with this generation because I think that they have more contact with each other. There's more intermarriage. Um, there's more acculturation because they're children, grandchildren of immigrants. So I think it's very different now than when I was growing up. Where, I think especially with the experiences of the war, it was quite, still a major factor.
Yes, Naomi. While you were mentioning that, I had the question. You have a history with Hawaii and how that culture evolved. Right. You no longer live in Hawaii, but I wanted to know how have you seen the culture and this dynamic of uh, the you know the conflict between these different ethnic groups? How has that evolved?
It's complicated because I think, the basic history, as your class has probably read, is that, the original islands were discovered by Captain Cook. The missionaries came in trying to convert the natives to Christianity, and then that class became the plantation owners and basically became the power structure in Hawaii. It was called the Big Five. And they basically controlled all of the economics in the islands up until after the war. I think that what happened, as Eugene has pointed out, is that um, in order to deal with the labor issues, they imported first the Chinese, then the Japanese, and then Filipinos, and the successive different ethnic groups, and played them against each other to maintain a power structure. Um, After the war, I think a lot of people, especially the men, were coming back from their army experiences and which were much more politically galvanized. And there were this labor movement where there's more cooperation, especially between the Filipinos and the Japanese laborers. And so there was a shift. And so I think Hawaii was basically Republican before the war, and it shifted to Democrats. There are no Republicans hardly now in Hawaii. So there was a major change. But a lot of the things that happened then are still, I think, continuing with the majority power trying to sustain their own privileges. And right now that the island of Lanai is owned by Ellison. A substantial amount of acreage is owned by Zuckerberg on the island of Kauai. So they are taking, and Big Agra has different stations where because Hawaii is such a mild climate, they can have 3 crops a year. So they use these places to test their pesticides on their GMO crops. And so it has an impact on the environment and, on the people. And I think they are very good at using the law to work around and sort of keep the power structure the way it is.
It doesn't sound to me any different, except in the motivation to emigrate to the Hawaiian Islands than any of the other cultural groups we've been studying over the course of the last 3 months. I'm curious. Um, Hawaii was an independent kingdom mm, at one point, and for quite a long time until 1900, becoming a territory of the United States. How did that affect the identity of the Hawaiian um, uh, um, resident, um, various residents, of course, but how did that affect sort of the imposition of becoming a territory of the United States?
Well, I think many Hawaiians saw it as illegal. There is I think back in the 60s, it's the Hawaiian Renaissance, but there is a certain stratum where the people are really angry at the white people, at tourists who just come in and disregard the land and trash it, or engage in high risk activities where the government has to go out and rescue them at expense to the taxpayers. So, there is a really anti-Howley sentiment, and it was so bad at one point that the government had to advertise to the people that, this is your livelihood. Tourists bring in money, and if you don't have the money, then you're going to have to move to the mainland. So there is that, and it continues. The friction continues between people who want to, take advantage of the existing power structure for their own means. For example, there is a wind farm in part of Oahu, and the choice of where the wind farm was placed displaced a lot of very poor people. So, it's that kind of tension where the poor people or the Native Hawaiians are really disadvantaged. And, I don't know if you were aware that on Haleakala there's an observatory. There was a huge hubbub about that because they wanted to carve out the land to put in another telescope, and it's sacred land. So things like this continue, and I think there have been court cases and all these things or demonstrations, but in the end, you know, um, most of the time, things just continue the way they do.
Hearing you recount these truths, I'm reminded of something Takaki talks about in the book. The master narrative, or the myth America perpetuates, that centers the white gaze, or the experiences of white people. And hearing these stories about these injustices committed to the native people of Hawaii, it flies in the face of Hawaii being this paradise of a retreat for the mainland, and the place where everyone is sunny and so forth. Do you think efforts from Native Hawaiians to achieve equity, do you think uh, overcoming the master narrative as a significant obstacle to them getting the sense of treatment and rights that ought to be afforded to them?
Well, I think as in other areas of society, and as we have seen in the pandemic, which really highlighted a lot of inequities, a lot of this is so systemic and structural that it's very hard to, root it out. You can do certain things, and I think that the situation is somewhat better with the younger generation. But you see it in all areas. It's not only in terms of land use and you know power. You see it in medicine where things are really stacked if you are not white and if you're not a white male. I mean, it goes to all these different areas that you see these inequities. It's not only, I mean, I think Hawaii is a microcosm. And if you look at the way it was taken over and what's being done in the South with voters' rights, it's the same thing. It's like the same playbook. It's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating if it weren't so awful.
I'm curious about this um, idea of the romanticization of the Hawaiian Islands. Of course, when technology developed airplane travel to be able to experience this mild climate, this climate that is hospitable to multiple crops and abundance of agriculture, let alone cultural experience of the Hawaiian peoples and those who made their homes in Hawaii. I just remember as a child watching old commercials of Pan Am clippers and whatnot, and Howleys being greeted with leis and by very beautiful young stewardesses on the ground and whatnot, and it just seemed so contradictory to me and how I was raised to understand the history that this is part of another part of the myth contributing to our overall cultural biases. Yes, I think that the profitability of the tourist industry is an important aspect of why Hawaii became a state eventually. But it also it seems like a discordant tone within my being, and it's something that often makes me very sad.
Well, Eugene, I think it was really good marketing. But it is a beautiful place. I think if you are respectful, people are very friendly. There is a spirit of aloha. It is and continues to be a more communal society, not as individualistic. Um, so, it is in some ways, but I think if you are that kind of a society, you're really disadvantaged when somebody comes in that has very individualistic, capitalistic, and they just want to monetize everything. So, I think, and also I think it's also dependent on who you are. So I think that people can see, if they're not stereotyping you, you can have those experiences where the people are really wonderful.
Do you think that the construction industry is having, you mentioned the health of the land. Do you think the construction industry is perpetuating the sustainability of relatively a small acreage of overall land versus some of the medium-sized states in the mainland? I personally worry about how long the Hawaiian Islands can survive this continual growth.
I will put it this way. Um, a lot of materials are imported from the mainland. And what my friend was telling me was that if shipping stopped for 2 weeks, we'd run out of food. So there is that dependence on, the mainland to bring in things, and there are farms now that are trying to be more sustainable, but, I think, it is a problem.
We were talking about, the master narrative and how these threads, similarly to, the South and what was done to the Native people of Hawaii when the Americans, the Howleys came over. Yeah, how do you see parallels between this, what is done now versus what has historically been done?
Well, in the South, there's all those things about voting rights. Well, one of the ways that the Hawaiians were um, taken over was that they rewrote the Constitution where, in order to vote, you had to have a certain amount of income and land. And so basically, it really disenfranchised everyone except for a few, wealthy Hawaiians and the white class. So, it's that kind of gerrymandering or, that kind of manipulation where, you disadvantage somebody. And, I think one of the things that also happened was that they changed the Constitution from Hawaiian law to common law. And the Hawaiians had no idea about how to navigate common law. So they were disadvantaged there. And then they had, it's called the Great Mahele, where where the king distributed the land. And the native Hawaiians had no idea about, land was held in common. No one owned the land. So they had no idea that they had to register and they didn't have the money to register. And so, basically they only ended up with 1% of the land. So, it's those kinds of inequities. And you're seeing it like right now in all of these states where they're just trying to, cut out people who are non-white from voting and gerrymandering districts that are really got the borders are so crazy in order to have a certain amount of, to keep the power concentrated so that you have a minority basically having more power than the majority. So, I think in that way, it's similar to what we're seeing now. It's so.
I was curious to ask if you thought that there was something you would love to say from your life experience about I personally think it's incredibly precious for mainlanders to have access and have the enjoyment of what's left of the Hawaiian culture and its history. And you talked about respect for the land, but can you speak more about how we can approach even as tourists, if we were to become tourists, to the Hawaiian Islands, what types of things are we unconscious about in terms of respect for the land, respect for the culture, respect for the native peoples, and the structural hierarchies that we're not aware of? What would you um, uh, recommend us to consider were we to visit the Hawaiian Islands so that we would um, cultivate that respect?
Well, I think educating this class and having these conversations, just educating um, people that you can make unconscious assumptions about others, and it's very difficult sometimes to take the other person's point of view because it's never been challenged. So I think that this is a consciousness raising kind of I think the consciousness raising is good. And I think and I don't think it's only going to Hawaii. I think when people are on vacation, it's like you leave all of your inhibitions at home. And I don't think it's just tourists coming to Hawaii. I think it's tourists going anywhere. I mean, you go to downtown or the boardwalk and you see these people, walking around Venice, and you know, that you, and there's something about the psychology that if you're not at home, the same restrictions don't apply. But I think that if you're respectful, that you may unconsciously maybe offend somebody, but it's different than if you are that ugly American. I think people pick up on who you are, and so that unless you do something really offensive, I think most people will be open and friendly. It's when people go off the trails, or they don't want to wear a mask, or they just really are just don't think the rules apply to them. And I think this is anywhere. It's not only in Hawaii.
Thank you. Yes, it's clear to see that in general, Americans don't appreciate the distinct subcultures or the ways of different people around the country. They're like, there's the term ugly American. So there is a unfortunate tradition of Americans feeling like wherever they go, what they do is how things ought to be done. So it's good to have some encouragement or some reinforcement to obey or respect the ways of the places we visit, if only for our own cultural education and, to strengthen our ability to empathize and, expand our worldview.
And I think people appreciate that and will pick up on it. I think, if you approach people sincerely, then, you may do something that offends them, but, it's repairable. It's when people just run roughshod over and just have a sense of entitlement that I think this is what stirs up that kind of anger.
Say a little more about entitlement in terms of racial divide from your experience.
This is so, and I'm not sure I can, because it's so, for me, I mean, it's like walking down the sidewalk. Who's going to give way? Who's going to, so it's like, and I think what they have studies have shown are, if you have cars at intersections, people with the more high status cars disregard the rules and will take their turn before it's their turn. I mean, I think it's that kind of thing. Um, and then, of course, it goes to more, you know, more major things. So, it's, I don't know. The people will make assumptions, like they will look at you and say, oh, this is a lower status person, and then I can do this. I don't know if you've had any experiences like this where, you are not white. And then so people will just assume that because you aren't, and if they are white, then they can take certain liberties, and at some point it can be so unconscious they don't even know that they're doing it. It can be in body language, it can be in the way they talk to you. Um, I have had people talk to me. It's, um, I think because I'm Asian, people think that some people have thought that I was like an immigrant and, you know, poor. And I'm thinking, this is crazy, you know, um, without knowing who you are. So I think it's that those kind of unconscious biases that people have. And I think it's only through conversation and getting to know the other person that, you flush these out, and then people can have a more accurate and more meaningful relationship with you. But if they just see you on the basis of what what your presentation is, and you have no control over that, then I think unconsciously, and I don't think people are doing this on purpose. I think um, it's establishing where you are in the pecking order, and what's permissible and what's not permissible, and what you can expect, not expect. And we have to do this in order to function in society, because you have to organize the world in some way so it's more manageable.
You asked if I've ever had that experience, and certainly walking down the street and essentially feeling invisible because you have to give way every single time. But the traditional or the more common experience for me is just because the way I present, and I'm part Hawaiian, is sort of the perception of being other uh, often results in one of two types of questions or experiences. The first is the slow talking experience. Can you tell me how to get to whatever boulevard or Mauna Loa Mall or whatever? And the other one is, where are you from? I mean, what are you? I mean, what I'm talking about is where's your family from? And none of those questions have a one word or two word response. And it's just so you asked if I had that experience, but that's sort of how I have gone through life, relating to some of the things that you just mentioned.
Well, and it's even more nuanced than that, because I am a quarter Korean. And so Asians can't identify me. And I've been told by Chinese that I can pass as Chinese. So when I meet them, they say, where are you from? Where is your family from? And so I think it's a way of trying to identify the other person. And yeah, but I think that and I've had those experiences the way you've had them, Eugene. It's really kind of off-putting, because I wouldn't say, oh, where are you from? Are you from Ireland or Portugal? Or, it's because I think everything is normed against white culture. So, I think it's so interesting how we put people into categories, and on the basis of that, it's like you just react to the categories rather than, you see it through this lens, and it's distorted, and you don't get the richness or, who the other person actually is or could be, or who you could be to that person.
Uh, yes. In our, I think that kind of ties into something that took place during our last group meeting, Eugene, where we were running through an exercise, and you mentioned the idea of bias and how some of it is biological, and it seems what we've recently been talking about, with people trying to I guess maybe objectifying a way to classify someone that it seems are where we as people struggle to take people as individuals or as a unique experience or to accept people where they are. And in in this case, in the cases you, Naomi, and Eugene mentioned, it causes you, it others you, it causes you to feel uncomfortable and leery of what the intention of this person asking the question may have.
Yeah. You must have experienced it too.
Yes, yes. I guess although I don't get the where you're from. I think for lack of a better word, lack of a for better or for worse. I think even though African Americans have you know their treatment is unequal, I think people assume unless you were to speak with an accent from the Caribbean or from Africa that you're that you're one of us, you're American. But I do know, like, I definitely have the experience where you're walking down the street and people act like you're not there, or I kind of feel like I'm on an obstacle course, walking down the sidewalk sometimes. Um, and I know more so when I was in college, I would always get the sense that people didn't know how to read me. They're like, he's obviously black, but he's not like the other ones. So and that kind of puts me, I always felt uncomfortable with that because I'm black and I'm happy to be black, but it kind of makes you question, what do people really think about black people if what I present as is so uncomfortable to them.
But there also, I would think, is a certain amount of curiosity that people are just monkeys. We're monkeys basically, and you just want to know about other people. I think it's a categorization after the curiosity that can be toxic. Is the separation into who's better, who's subservient. I think that part of it is very difficult. But I think people are curious. Like when I met you, I thought, oh, who is this person? And I think that's fair enough. I mean, you want to be curious. You don't want to just you know um, not be.
Right, right. I know. I grew up in St. Louis, which is a very it lacks diversity. It's pretty much 60% white, 39% black, and 1% other ethnic groups. So it wasn't until I came out to California that, I mean, I lived out here in San Francisco about 20 years ago. Then I moved here to LA about 5 years ago, and it's been interesting to know how my biases present and how the unfortunate conditioning that I've been presented just by living in America and not being presented with images of, Asian Americans or Latinos or other groups that are, full ranging and including the depth of people's experiences. It's I feel like I do have that positive or natural spontaneous curiosity, but yeah, it's it I didn't realize how much of the unconscious bias I had that I until I moved here. So yeah, I think it's just incumbent on people to take the time to educate themselves or be willing to feel a little out of sorts until you're able to accept that no, this person is they're perfectly fine, and or they have a difference which is really interesting, and I feel a need to explore.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so much of this is human. It's very human, and yet, layered on top of it are all these other constructs like race. We haven't even talked about gender. Um, and socioeconomic class. We have all these biases, and it's when we automatically assume that somebody is a certain way because of our biases. I think it's really important that what you're doing is making people examine their own biases. That we all have them. We can't not have them. But at least knowing that, then you can factor it into how you move in the world.
But there has been a toll on a very small acreage of land that now belongs to the United States that I'm not sure anybody has a plan to address so that the land returns to its natural beauty and its natural richness.
Yes, this whole thing with climate change is tremendously complex, and I think one of the problems is that we're starting to see the effects, but most people live day to day rather than looking into the future. And so we're in the situation that it's like that analogy of being a lobster in a pot, and as they're swimming around and the pot gradually boils until that's the end of them, is that you know um, we make these small adjustments until the point where we can't, where there's some kind of tipping point where we can't make the adjustment anymore. Oh, I was just going to say, you don't have to look very far to see that the planet is changing, and you can only do so much before it has consequences.
Yeah, it's such a huge topic,
Yeah, I think
and
it's
I have such a deep love for one part of my cultural heritage. But let me turn towards this lobster pot metaphor that you use, because it's often a metaphor that is used. A similar metaphor is used in Filipino culture, of course, which is very has um, a percentage in the Hawaiian Islands. In Philippine culture, whether it be American assimilated Philippine Americans, or Filipinos aspiring to become American and emigrate, there's this metaphor that is spoken about by sociologists that's called the crab mentality. And in harvesting of crabs from the deep sea, crabs basically just as they get to the top, the ones that are below them drag the one that's about to escape down below them so that they can get higher. And it's a sociological, I'm sure I'm not an expert, culture phenomenon that is very evident in my experience of working for the Philippine government and working in the Philippines and having to live there, and actually seeing it manifest in generations of Philippine Americans living in the United States. It's that othering to become the accepted norm, and that metaphor of the crab mentality is an incredible stigma on our my Philippine heritage.
I wonder whether it is more something that is related to how collective the society is, because the Hawaiians have the same thing, is that you can't get too ambitious or stand out. Um, and I think also in Japanese culture, the nail that sticks out gets pounded down. And these are a more collective society. So I don't know if there's some correlation between that. Whereas with a more individualistic society, it's everyone for themselves.
No, that's an interesting read on this experience, because in the Black community there's a similar experience where people who are men and women who are upwardly mobile, sometimes they're labeled as that they're not in touch with their culture, or that they have errors about them. And I think the collectivist versus individualistic um cultural value may tie into that. Yeah. um yeah, and it's a shame, because it's limiting the potential of people who do have the opportunity, who hopefully would take that opportunity and share it with people who are less advantaged. But it does it it does limit people in an unfortunate way.
And but the other consequence of it is that it keeps the power structure intact. That if you suppress the people who have energy and vision and who want to get out of it, and then it's tamped down, then basically you're maintaining the status quo. That's why I think it's so deep rooted that I'm not sure how things change.
It's a complex web, and we've continued
Yeah.
to come to that conclusion again and again, and it has to be addressed from the bottom up and from the top down, and from the middle outward. It has to be a 360-degree approach to this complex web, but at least the self-introspection that we're doing is one aspect that needs to be done and is vitally important. I want to sort of maybe end our conversation with just some everybody's general thoughts about how can we look at the experience of being othered, whether as various Asian um, uh, cultures embodied in one individual, or a complexity of historical cultures that come from the importation of slaves from Africa. Here in the United States, we have to live with each other, and we have to make this a better situation and a better place for ourselves and for our generations that come after us. And so the question that I want to kind of end with, just to toss around between us, is uh, how do we put an end to the karmic pattern of that othering from our own experience? What do we do from our own responsibility, and what do we invite others to look at? How can we, the three of us, what tools can we think of with the circles that we cohabit, um, utilize to make this awkwardness move towards a more less biased experience of society that we're all having?
I think the conversation itself, where we've been open, curious, respectful, models that kind of conversation. And granted, we are not white. You may be part white, Eugene, I don't know. But that it is a model for what you can do on an individual level. But I think a lot of this is going to have to be systemic. There, the whole thing about inequalities of wealth, about the way the power structure is, people can do their part within it. But, I think that, on a personal level, it's having these kinds of conversations. The other thing I think is that even though racially we are other, I think individually, I think it's part of the human condition that everybody thinks that they're other. And the way you deal with it, whether you objectify and then play it out and project it onto some other group, or whether you try to in some ways reconcile it with yourself. I mean, we're all struggling, I think, with that same issue. It's how does it play itself out? And I think what we're dealing with, now that I think about it, are the different projections of who the other is, so that you don't have to feel as the other. So I think that I really appreciate and applaud the people who are taking your class, because they are making an honest attempt to start to reflect. And I think we all at some point don't feel that we belong, even in the best of families, circles of friendships. We all have had experiences where it's like being in middle school. You don't have to be a certain race to feel like you're outside of you have, the cool kids and you're not a cool kid. So, but I think it's the way it gets expressed, whether you demonize the people and they become the scapegoats for yourself so that you are one of the in group and they are out. Um, and I think, maybe understanding that dynamic and also how we have these constructs that have nothing to do with world. I mean, you have these kids, you've heard these stories about the teacher says you're the blue kid and you're the green kid. And within, a day, there's a dominant and a subordinate class. So it doesn't even have to be on the basis of race. I think it's part of how we're wired because we were raised in tribes and we're still at some level very tribal. So I think just realizing that it's human and yeah, you act in ways and you feel in ways that can be shameful, but we're also other things too. We are more than just our biases, and we have some good biases too. Where we can see good in people even when they're not good. So it's all a mixed bag.
I think one thing that I picked up while going through this course and observing the participants in Eugene and the other people who have appeared on these supplemental materials or the podcast or the video cast is just how striking authenticity and the willingness to be vulnerable around someone. Like I think I think Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this when he says or this may be something embedded in some of the formal teachings of Buddhism, but the diamond that cuts through, that sense of compassion and being having someone lay themselves bare. And I think like you mentioned, Nami, on an individual level, I think that goes a long way to, at the very least, allowing people to express themselves, even if they have viewpoints that are more that reflect a certain sense of a lack of knowledge or a lack of appreciation of people who are different or other from them. So I think as we continue to progress, after today or after the course Eugene and I are putting on continue unfolds, that doing the self teaching, the self education that this course provides, and also uh, being comfortable, being uncomfortable, kind of pushing your boundaries and seeing where that leads. And of course, I guess in a way, maybe Eugene and I need to market this to people in the government, because I think there are a lot of people who do need to do some reflecting on what they carry with them day to day, and how that affects the policies or the decisions they make. So I think I think this course is doing something very substantial in a small, not albeit in a small way, but hopefully from this other uh, the participants get inspired to share what they've learned through their experience, and things sprinkle from there.
I have one last thing to say is that, in child development between mother and child, even in good relationships, there is attunement only 30% of the time. So there are ruptures that occur. And so, what is really important to understand is it's not the rupture, it's the repair. So, you may be in a relationship where it's difficult or, you flub up something or, somebody offends you. Yeah, that happens. But how do you repair that? And so I think that's a really important thing too, to let your participants know is that, yeah, no one's perfect, but, how do you go beyond that, to some kind of a repair?
That's very, very powerful and useful. And maybe my contribution will be a much shorter, but a very pithy, twofold, either exercise or something to contemplate and consider. And the first part is when you go to a grocery store and you're not experiencing the uncomfortableness of otherness around you, perhaps it would be good to question why your grocery store choice is more homogeneous with your own experience. And the second part of the reflection or the exercise is that walking down that street or going into that grocery store and having the experience of someone else being other, um, if you can try to visualize that person as somebody near and dear to you, first and foremost, before maybe not a romantic near and dear, but a tender grandmotherly or grandchildly or nephew niece type um, bond, where there aren't those walls, and take the risk, whatever that risk is, to ask the question or to open the door or to give way, or to pass or to lift a heavy item off of the grocery shelf if it's an elderly person, and so on. So um, I'm not doing this myself, but I have in my life, and but that would be my my contribution to the question that I prompted. This has been a wonderful, very rich and diverse discussion, Naomi, and I so thank you for agreeing to join us to flesh out some of these topics and some of these issues. Please remember to like and subscribe to our podcast series on YouTube, and share with your friends if you found these helpful, and therefore you also be able to stay tuned to any further podcasts or video casts, as well as any other projects that Courage to Look will be doing. So with that, thank you very much.